England greeted the summer of 1887 with bright skies, fragrant rose gardens, and golden wheat rippling beneath warm breezes, as though every corner of the kingdom had forgotten sorrow. Village bells rang across peaceful valleys, children laughed beside sparkling streams, and merchants filled bustling market squares with flowers, ribbons, and fresh bread. At the heart of that hopeful season stood Ashcombe Palace, where banners honoring Duke Lucian Ashcombe fluttered proudly above ancient stone towers. Across England he was celebrated as a fearless commander whose victories had ended years of bloodshed, a nobleman whose courage seemed beyond question. Yet the greatest trial of his life waited not upon a battlefield but within the walls of his own home. Lucian was 34, disciplined, honorable, and admired by kings as much as common soldiers. His stern composure concealed a deeply loyal heart that believed truth should never bend before convenience. His young wife, Lady Elara Beaumont Ashcombe, possessed none of his commanding presence, yet people remembered her far more easily. At 25 she carried herself with quiet grace, greeting servants by name, comforting frightened children with gentle smiles, and speaking to stable boys with the same respect she offered distinguished guests. Many called her the warmest soul ever to enter Ashcombe Palace. Others quietly despised her because kindness often exposed selfishness more clearly than cruelty. Few nobles knew that Elara secretly devoted much of her allowance to orphanages scattered throughout the countryside. Wrapped in a plain cloak instead of embroidered silk, she visited hungry children without announcing her title. She carried baskets of bread, medicine, blankets, and books, kneeling beside sick beds without hesitation. She paid widows' debts through trusted priests, arranged apprenticeships for abandoned boys, and taught young girls to read beneath shady oak trees. Whenever grateful villagers tried to thank her, she simply smiled and asked them to help another person whenever fortune allowed. Compassion came to her as naturally as breathing. Inside the palace, servants adored their duchess because she never allowed rank to erase humanity. She learned birthdays, celebrated weddings in the kitchens, and insisted every household employee receive warm meals before lavish banquets began upstairs. Elderly housemaids often remarked that the palace itself seemed brighter whenever Lady Elara walked its corridors. Only one man watched her growing affection among the people with silent resentment. Lord Cedric Hawthorne, Lucian's cousin, believed Ashcombe's title should have belonged to him. Every smile directed toward Elara deepened the bitterness he had nurtured since childhood. When diplomats requested Lucian's leadership in negotiating a fragile peace treaty overseas, duty demanded months away from England. Before departing, he embraced Elara beneath blooming climbing roses, promising he would return before the harvest festival. She watched his carriage disappear through the palace gates with hopeful eyes, unaware it would be their last peaceful farewell. Weeks later, a physician confirmed she carried Lucian's child. Joy overwhelmed her. She immediately wrote letter after letter describing the wonderful news, imagining the happiness shining across her husband's face when he read them. None of those letters ever reached him. Cedric intercepted every message before it crossed the estate. Patiently weaving a web of deception, he forged passionate correspondence supposedly exchanged between Elara and an invented lover. He bribed the royal physician to alter medical dates, threatened frightened clerks into changing official records, and quietly paid dishonest servants to spread poisonous rumors through noble drawing rooms. Every lie strengthened another until fiction appeared more convincing than truth itself. By the time Lucian completed the peace treaty and began his journey home, Cedric had transformed innocent anticipation into calculated suspicion. Meanwhile, whispers spread beyond the palace walls with frightening speed. Society ladies repeated every invented scandal over afternoon tea, while ambitious lords predicted the downfall of the Ashcombe marriage. Honest servants wanted to defend their mistress but feared dismissal or imprisonment if they challenged Cedric's influence. Falsehood traveled faster than loyalty, until silence itself became another accomplice. Months passed, and Elara safely delivered a healthy baby boy with bright curious eyes and a strong cry that filled the nursery with hope. She spent each afternoon standing beside the palace entrance, holding their son while watching the distant road. Servants smiled tenderly whenever she hurried forward at every approaching carriage, believing the Duke had finally returned. She imagined placing the infant into Lucian's waiting arms and telling him they were a family at last. Even the elderly housemaid Agnes quietly embroidered a tiny blue blanket, whispering blessings over every careful stitch. Lucian returned beneath brilliant summer sunshine, but instead of embracing his wife he entered the palace carrying Cedric's carefully prepared evidence. Forged letters, altered records, whispered testimonies, and false timelines convinced his disciplined mind that betrayal had entered his household. Rather than speaking privately with Elara, he summoned the royal court. Nobles filled the grand hall. Soldiers lined polished marble walls. Servants stood trembling near towering windows. Elara entered carrying her sleeping son, smiling softly because she believed this gathering celebrated peace abroad and new life at home. Silence fell as Lucian looked upon the child without reaching for him. Pain hardened every familiar feature until he seemed almost a stranger. When Elara stepped closer, hope shining through exhausted eyes, he removed her wedding ring with cold, deliberate hands. Before the assembled court he declared, "Neither you nor that child will ever bear my name." Shock rippled across the chamber. Elara tried to speak, but he turned away. Cedric signaled guards forward while laughing nobles whispered cruel judgments. Outside, servants under Cedric's orders threw her belongings into the mud before the palace gates. Elara quietly gathered each tiny garment, lifted her son against her uninjured heart, and climbed into a waiting carriage without shedding a single public tear. As the wheels began rolling away, old Agnes kissed the baby's blanket and whispered, "One day your grace will know the truth." Behind them, Lucian stood motionless beneath the blazing summer sky, unaware he had just exiled the only family he would ever truly love. Elara held her sleeping son close as the carriage rolled away from Ashcombe Palace. Every turn of the wheels carried her farther from the life she had built with love, yet she refused to let despair touch the child resting against her heart. Tears gathered silently but never fell. She remembered Lucian's face in the great hall and the terrible certainty in his voice. She still loved him, despite the wound his judgment had carved into her soul. Unknown to her, Cedric had already dispatched hired mercenaries with strict orders. Neither mother nor child must survive the journey. If they vanished, no witness would remain to challenge his claim over Ashcombe. The riders waited within a dense forest where ancient oaks blocked the afternoon sun and muffled every sound except birds and creaking branches. The coachman, an aging royal servant named Walter, sensed danger before anyone spoke. His weathered hands tightened upon the reins while his eyes searched the shadows. "Stay down," he warned softly. Elara instinctively wrapped herself around her infant just as the first arrow shattered the carriage window. Glass scattered across velvet cushions like frozen rain. Another arrow struck the carriage door, then another buried itself beside Walter. The horses reared violently, screaming with terror as hidden attackers emerged between the trees. Walter whipped the frightened team forward while Elara shielded her baby beneath her own body. An arrow ripped across her shoulder, tearing fabric and flesh together. Pain stole her breath, but she never loosened her embrace. Walter turned the carriage sharply toward a narrow farm track, buying precious moments before three mercenaries galloped alongside. One climbed onto the rear step with a drawn knife. Walter seized an iron lantern and struck him across the face, sending him crashing beneath pounding hooves. Another attacker fired again. This time the arrow pierced Walter's side. Blood spread across his coat, yet he kept driving. The forest finally opened onto rolling wheat fields glowing beneath brilliant summer light. Walter brought the wounded horses to a halt beside a modest farmhouse. "Run," he whispered. Elara stumbled into waist-high wheat, clutching her son while blood streamed from her shoulder. Walter turned the carriage around alone, deliberately drawing every mercenary after him. His final sacrifice echoed across the fields as distant gunshots and terrified horses faded into silence. A farming couple found Elara collapsed beside a windmill before sunset. Thomas Miller and his wife Martha carried both mother and child into their humble cottage without asking questions. Martha cleaned the deep wound with boiled water and herbs while Thomas stood watch through the night carrying an old hunting rifle. Their grandson Samuel gently rocked the baby whenever Elara drifted into exhausted sleep. When strength slowly returned, Elara thanked them but refused to reveal her true identity. She simply said her husband believed a terrible lie and that she wished only to protect her son. Thomas never pressed further. "Names matter less than character," he replied. Those simple words offered more comfort than any promise spoken inside palaces. Weeks passed beneath cloudless skies. Although her shoulder remained painfully scarred, Elara insisted on earning her place. She harvested wheat beside Martha, baked bread before dawn, stitched torn clothing, and taught village children to read beneath a spreading oak. Whenever sickness visited neighboring cottages, she carried medicine, cooled fevers, and stayed until frightened families smiled again. The villagers believed she was a widow whose quiet strength deserved respect rather than pity. Her little boy flourished among fields instead of marble halls. Farmers carried him upon broad shoulders, children sang to him during harvest, and elderly women knitted tiny blankets. Elara discovered that genuine affection required neither crowns nor titles. Each evening she watched the sunset with her son asleep against her heart, praying only that bitterness would never become his inheritance. She never spoke ill of Lucian before the villagers. When Samuel innocently asked whether the baby's father would ever come, Elara smiled through fresh sorrow and answered, "Your father should always be remembered for his finest qualities, even when life becomes unbearably painful." Thomas overheard those words and later told Martha that only a truly noble woman could protect another's reputation while carrying such undeserved suffering. The villagers gradually began calling her the Summer Angel because hope seemed to follow wherever she walked. Children waited outside the cottage each morning carrying slates and worn books. Elderly laborers left baskets of fresh fruit at her door despite having little themselves. Elara accepted every kindness with humble gratitude and quietly shared whatever she received with families poorer than her own. She believed generosity multiplied only when passed forward. Even wounded, she inspired others to forgive, serve, and endure. Unknown to everyone, Cedric's surviving mercenaries still searched nearby roads, questioning travelers and offering coins for information about a woman carrying an infant. Thomas secretly warned neighboring farmers to report strangers immediately. Their quiet vigilance created an invisible shield around the little family, though danger lingered beyond every sunny hill, patiently awaiting another chance to steal their fragile future forever away again. Far away, Cedric continued feeding Lucian carefully crafted lies. He claimed Elara had fled with another man and abandoned every trace of shame. Lucian dismissed the stories aloud, yet unease quietly settled inside him. He buried himself in estate duties, inspected regiments, and attended endless council meetings, but every empty corridor reminded him of the woman who once filled Ashcombe with warmth. Late one peaceful evening, searching an unused cabinet, Lucian discovered a small velvet box overlooked during Elara's departure. Inside rested the royal family locket she had always worn. He opened it expecting jewels. Instead he found a tiny painted portrait of himself smiling beside blank space reserved for their future child. Folded beneath the miniature rested delicate handwritten words, "My only home." His hands began trembling as certainty finally cracked. And at that very moment an elderly royal midwife crossed Ashcombe's gates carrying sealed records that could destroy every lie he had ever believed. The elderly royal midwife arrived at Ashcombe Palace before sunrise, leaning heavily upon a polished ash cane while clutching a weathered leather satchel against her chest. Every guard recognized Margaret Ellis, the woman who had delivered generations of Ashcombe heirs, and none questioned her urgency. Her silver hair escaped beneath a faded bonnet, her face lined by age rather than fear. She demanded to see Duke Lucian immediately, declaring that the future of his family depended upon what she carried. Lucian received her inside his private study, where the open locket still rested upon the desk before him. Sleep had abandoned him entirely. The tiny painted portrait of himself and the unfinished space reserved for a child had unsettled every certainty Cedric had carefully planted. Margaret studied his exhausted face before placing several sealed documents upon the table. Her hands trembled, not from weakness alone, but from years of carrying a burden too heavy for one conscience. "I failed your Duchess," she whispered. "I will not fail her again." She broke the oldest wax seal first. Inside lay the original birth records bearing authentic dates, signatures, and the official royal stamp. Every page contradicted the altered documents Lucian had accepted without question. The child had been conceived before his diplomatic departure exactly as Elara had tried to explain. Margaret revealed that Cedric had threatened the lives of servants, physicians, and their families unless they cooperated. She herself had hidden the originals beneath the chapel floor, waiting for a moment when truth might survive longer than lies. Lucian stared silently at the records. His breathing slowed until the room seemed stripped of every sound except the faint ticking of the mantel clock. At last he asked only one question. "Is the boy truly mine?" Margaret met his eyes without hesitation. "He has always been your son." The words shattered something deep inside him. He stumbled backward until his knees struck the stone floor. Every memory returned with merciless clarity. Elara waiting beside the palace gates, the hopeful smile when she carried the baby into the great hall, the trembling confusion in her eyes as he removed her wedding ring. He had mistaken unwavering devotion for betrayal. The greatest commander in England had been defeated by deception without drawing a single sword. His grief spread quickly through the palace. Summoned before the council, the royal physician finally confessed everything. Cedric had bribed him with gold, threatened disgrace, and forced him to alter medical records. Several terrified clerks admitted changing official dates under direct orders. A handwriting expert exposed the forged love letters after comparing them with Elara's genuine correspondence. One frightened servant produced the intercepted bundle of unopened letters she had written to Lucian during his absence. Their faded pages contained nothing except love, hope, and joyful anticipation for the child they would raise together. Lucian opened the first letter with shaking hands. Elara had described feeling the baby's first tiny movement beneath her heart and wondering whether he would inherit his father's courage or his smile. Another letter spoke about decorating the nursery with blue ribbons because she somehow believed they would have a son. The final unfinished letter ended with a simple promise: "Come home safely. Our little family is waiting." Ink stains marked the page where tears had fallen before it was stolen away. Unable to bear another word, Lucian dismissed the council and walked alone into the palace chapel. Sunlight streamed through colored glass, painting the stone floor with brilliant summer colors that mocked his sorrow. He knelt before the altar where he and Elara had exchanged their vows years earlier. For the first time since boyhood, he prayed without pride. He begged not for forgiveness because he knew he had done nothing deserving it, but only for one chance to tell her the truth. When he rose, his purpose had become unmistakably clear. "Cedric is to be arrested for treason, conspiracy, attempted murder, and fraud," he ordered. Soldiers rode immediately toward Cedric's estate. They arrived too late. Servants reported that Cedric had fled only hours earlier after burning private papers and emptying hidden vaults. Several horses were missing, along with armed retainers loyal only to coin. Lucian realized his cousin already knew the conspiracy had collapsed. Every wasted minute placed Elara and their son in greater danger. Ignoring exhausted advisors, Lucian saddled his fastest black stallion and rode north without ceremony. Dust rose behind him as he crossed villages, rivers, and endless golden fields, asking every traveler about a young mother carrying an infant. Most knew exactly whom he described. Farmers smiled warmly while pointing toward a modest settlement where, they said, an angel seemed to have appeared among ordinary people. By late afternoon Lucian reached the village. He remained hidden beneath trees overlooking the central green, afraid to face the woman he had destroyed. There he saw Elara kneeling beside an injured horse, carefully washing a bleeding leg despite the scar still visible across her own shoulder. Children surrounded her with complete trust, laughing as they handed clean cloths and buckets of water. When the horse finally stood again, the villagers applauded while little boys hugged her skirts. An elderly widow pressed fresh bread into Elara's hands, insisting she had earned it. Instead of keeping it, Elara quietly divided the loaf among hungry children before taking a single piece for herself. Thomas Miller noticed the stranger watching from the trees and approached cautiously. Before Lucian revealed his name, Thomas spoke with unmistakable pride. "She fed us before feeding herself." Those words wounded more deeply than any accusation. Lucian stepped forward at last, ready to beg forgiveness, when terrified screams shattered the peaceful evening. Armed riders burst across the fields, scattering villagers in every direction. Cedric himself led them, his face twisted with desperate fury. Before anyone could react, his men seized Elara and tore the crying child from Thomas's arms before forcing both into a waiting carriage. Cedric shouted that if he could not inherit Ashcombe, neither would Lucian's precious heir. Horses lunged forward, wheels thundered across the road toward the southern coast, and Lucian leaped onto his stallion, driving after the disappearing carriage with every remaining hope racing ahead of him. Lucian's black stallion thundered across the dusty summer road with such relentless speed that frightened birds burst from hedgerows before him. Every powerful stride echoed the desperation beating inside his chest. Ahead, Cedric's carriage disappeared beyond rolling hills, leaving a cloud of golden dust hanging beneath the brilliant afternoon sky. Lucian ignored the burning in his lungs, the sting of sweat in his eyes, and the countless thoughts accusing him of every mistake that had brought them to this terrible moment. The only truth that mattered now was reaching Elara before it became too late. Inside the racing carriage, Elara struggled to steady herself while clutching her terrified son. Cedric's men had bound her wrists loosely enough to avoid slowing their escape but tightly enough to prevent resistance. The baby cried against her shoulder as rough roads jolted the carriage violently from side to side. Through the narrow window she caught sight of a lone rider gaining ground behind them. Even from a distance she recognized Lucian's posture upon horseback. For one impossible heartbeat hope flickered inside her. Then painful memories returned. She convinced herself he pursued only the Ashcombe heir, not the woman he had cast aside. Turning toward the frightened driver forced to obey Cedric's orders, she whispered through trembling lips, "Please, don't stop." Those words reached Cedric and a cruel smile crossed his face. "You see," he sneered. "Even now she knows why he comes. A duke never chases a wife he has discarded. He chases his blood." Elara lowered her eyes, refusing to answer. She would not allow Cedric the satisfaction of seeing fresh tears. Instead, she kissed her son's forehead and silently prayed that whatever happened next, the child would survive long enough to know he had always been loved. Lucian finally drew close enough for Cedric's rearguards to attack. 4 mounted mercenaries wheeled across the road, blocking his path with flashing swords. Lucian never slowed. His horse crashed directly into the first attacker, throwing the man into roadside grass. Steel rang against steel as Lucian parried another blade, striking its owner from the saddle before urging his exhausted stallion onward. A third rider caught Lucian across the shoulder with the flat of a sword, nearly unseating him. Pain exploded through his arm, but he forced himself upright and continued the pursuit without looking back. Every heartbeat lost to combat carried Elara farther away. The chase swept through wheat fields glowing beneath relentless sunshine. Harvest workers abandoned their tools to watch horses race past like a storm crossing peaceful land. Dust coated Lucian's face until blood and earth became indistinguishable upon his skin. Still he refused to slow. He remembered every unopened letter, every hopeful word stolen before reaching him, and each memory became another reason to keep moving despite exhaustion threatening to overcome him. Cedric ordered archers riding beside the carriage to finish the pursuit. Arrows hissed through the hot afternoon air. One buried itself in Lucian's saddle. Another sliced across his cheek, drawing a line of bright blood. His stallion stumbled after clipping a hidden stone but somehow recovered. Lucian leaned low against the horse's neck, urging the faithful animal onward with gentle words instead of desperate commands. The stallion answered with one final burst of strength that carried them almost alongside the fleeing carriage. A mercenary swung a heavy club into the horse's chest. The magnificent animal cried out and collapsed beneath Lucian, sending both crashing across the hard road. Momentum hurled the duke through loose gravel until his hands and knees were torn raw. His horse struggled once, breathed heavily, then lay still. Lucian crawled to its head, touching the trembling muzzle with heartbreaking gratitude before forcing himself to stand. Tears blurred his vision, yet he turned toward the disappearing carriage and began running on foot. Every step felt impossible. His boots struck scorching earth while blood soaked his torn sleeves and trickled into his gloves. Farmers shouted for him to stop before he collapsed. He ignored every voice except the memory of Elara calling his name long ago with absolute trust. He had failed that trust once. He would not fail again. The road narrowed toward an ancient wooden bridge spanning a deep river gorge. Built decades earlier, the bridge groaned beneath the weight of Cedric's speeding carriage. Rotten beams cracked loudly as frightened horses lunged across weathered planks. Cedric screamed at the driver to move faster, caring nothing for the danger beneath them. Lucian saw the bridge shifting long before anyone else recognized the threat. He shouted for them to halt. His warning vanished beneath splintering timber. One rear wheel struck a broken plank and exploded into fragments. The carriage lurched violently sideways, smashing through the crumbling railing before hanging halfway over the roaring river below. Horses screamed in panic, suspended between solid ground and empty air. Inside, Elara clutched her son as the carriage tilted dangerously toward the gorge. Every movement threatened to send all three plunging into the rushing water beneath. Without hesitation, Lucian climbed over the shattered railing and lowered himself beneath the dangling carriage. Broken beams dug into his palms while the raging river thundered far below. He wedged his shoulders beneath the fractured axle just as another support beam snapped. Agony tore through his back, yet he pushed upward with everything remaining inside him. Slowly the carriage steadied enough for the door to open. "Come out," he gasped. Elara stared at him in disbelief. The man who had once rejected her now carried the crushing weight of the carriage upon his own body. She climbed carefully toward solid ground with their son held tightly against her chest. Halfway across, another beam cracked. Lucian cried out but refused to move. Only after Elara reached safety did he allow himself to breathe. Cedric attempted to leap past them toward the riverbank, but the weakened bridge finally surrendered. Splintered timber collapsed beneath his feet, sending him crashing into the churning water below. Swept helplessly downstream, he was dragged onto a muddy bank by waiting royal soldiers who had finally caught the chase. Bound in chains, he watched helplessly as every ambition disappeared beneath the same river that had almost claimed his victims. The last section of bridge gave way beneath Lucian moments later. Elara lunged forward with Thomas and several villagers who had followed the pursuit from nearby fields. Together they seized his arms before he could fall into the gorge. They pulled him onto solid ground just as the remaining structure disappeared into the river. Lucian lay motionless upon the grass, bruised, bleeding, and barely conscious. Their son reached toward him with tiny hands, no longer crying but quietly studying the exhausted stranger before him. Lucian opened his eyes one final time and looked not at the child first, but at Elara. His voice was little more than a broken whisper carried away by the warm summer wind. "If you can never forgive me," he said, tears mixing with dust upon his face, "let me spend the rest of my life earning the chance." His eyes slowly closed, and before anyone could tell whether he still lived, silence settled over the ruined bridge. Elara dropped to her knees beside Lucian before anyone else reached him. Dust clung to his torn clothes, blood stained his hands, and splinters from the broken bridge had carved deep wounds across his arms and shoulders. His breathing was shallow, his face almost as pale as the clouds drifting overhead. Only moments earlier he had held an entire carriage upon his own body to save the wife and son he had once rejected. The memory shattered the final wall around Elara's wounded heart. She gently lifted his head into her lap, brushing damp strands of dark hair from his forehead. Her tears finally came, not from anger, but from the unbearable weight of everything they had lost and everything that might still be saved. Thomas Miller quickly organized the nearby farmers. Together they carried Lucian on a sturdy wooden door lifted from an abandoned storage shed, using it as a makeshift stretcher. Martha hurried ahead to prepare clean linens, boiled water, and every medicinal herb she possessed. Samuel walked beside Elara, carefully carrying the sleeping child while glancing repeatedly at the unconscious Duke with frightened curiosity. None of the villagers spoke of titles or rank. They saw only a broken man whose sacrifice had nearly cost him his life. Back at the Miller farmhouse, Martha carefully removed Lucian's torn coat while Elara washed every wound with steady hands despite her own injured shoulder aching fiercely. She stitched cuts across his arms, wrapped bruised ribs, and cooled his fever through the long summer night. Every motion reminded her of countless strangers she had once nursed without expecting gratitude. This time, however, the patient was the man who had broken her heart. 3 days passed before Lucian finally stirred. Soft morning sunlight filtered through lace curtains as birds sang outside the open window. He slowly opened his eyes, confused by the unfamiliar wooden ceiling above him. Then he felt something warm resting against his chest. Their little son had fallen asleep there. The child lay peacefully with one tiny hand curled around Lucian's finger as though he had trusted him all his life. Lucian stared silently, afraid even to breathe. His eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. Elara, standing quietly beside the bed, answered with calm honesty. "No. But neither did our son deserve to grow up without his father." Lucian looked toward her, unable to hide his shame. "I believed lies because they were easier than trusting the woman who had never once given me reason to doubt her." Elara remained silent. "I opened every letter after it was too late," he continued. "I read every dream you tried to share with me. I know. I would surrender every title I possessed to erase that day. You cannot erase it." Her words carried no bitterness, only truth. "But you may choose what kind of man lives after it." Lucian closed his eyes. Those words would remain with him forever. During the following weeks, Lucian slowly regained his strength. Instead of returning immediately to Ashcombe Palace, he remained among the farming family whose kindness had preserved both Elara and himself. He helped Thomas repair fences despite lingering pain, carried water from the well, and worked beside ordinary laborers beneath the blazing summer sun without revealing the discomfort each movement caused. The villagers watched quietly. They saw no trace of pride in him anymore. One afternoon Lucian privately approached Thomas carrying a heavy leather chest filled with gold. "You saved my family." Thomas gently pushed it back toward him. "We did what decent people should do." "Please." Thomas smiled. "Your wife already repaid us." Lucian looked confused. "She taught our children compassion." He pointed toward the village green where Elara laughed with several young girls while teaching them to read beneath the same oak tree she had chosen months earlier. "Gold disappears," Thomas continued softly, "but kindness remains." Lucian understood then why the villagers loved her so deeply. They had never needed her title to recognize her worth. Meanwhile, royal soldiers transported Cedric back to Ashcombe under heavy guard. News of his crimes spread rapidly across England. Witnesses stepped forward one after another. The physician repeated his confession before the royal council. Clerks admitted altering official documents. Servants described years of intimidation. Mercenaries testified that Cedric had ordered the deaths of both mother and child. The trial lasted only 2 days. every forged letter, every stolen document, every attempted murder, every act of treason, all stood proven beyond doubt. Before nobles from across England, Cedric was stripped of every title, every estate, every privilege and every family honor. His signet ring was removed, his noble cloak torn away. The royal herald declared that Lord Cedric Hawthorne would spend the remainder of his life imprisoned for treason against both the crown and the House of Ashcombe. No voice rose in his defense. Justice finally belonged to truth. When Lucian returned to Ashcombe several weeks later, thousands gathered expecting magnificent celebrations honoring his survival. Instead, the palace gates remained closed. The Duke cancelled every parade. He refused fireworks. He declined expensive banquets prepared by London's finest chefs. Instead, invitations traveled throughout the countryside. Every servant, every farmer, every soldier, every widow, every orphan, every stable boy, every laundress, every child Elara had ever helped. They were all welcomed into the palace gardens. Long wooden tables stretched beneath blooming roses and ancient oak trees. Fresh bread, roasted meats, fruits, honey cakes, and summer berries covered white linen cloths. Musicians played cheerful melodies while children raced across green lawns without fear of offending royal etiquette. Servants sat beside noble officers. Farmers laughed with decorated veterans. Widows dined beside duchesses. For one extraordinary afternoon, Ashcombe belonged equally to everyone. At sunset, Lucian stepped onto a simple stone platform overlooking the gardens. He wore no ceremonial cape, no jeweled sword, only a plain dark suit. Elara stood several feet away holding their son, uncertain why the music had suddenly stopped. The entire gathering watched in complete silence. Lucian slowly walked toward her. Then before the whole kingdom, he knelt. Not because custom demanded it, not because politics required it, but because love and remorse left him no other place to stand. Gasps swept through the gardens. No duke in living memory had ever knelt publicly before anyone except the sovereign. Lucian reached into his pocket and removed the wedding ring he had taken from her months earlier. His hands trembled. "When I removed this ring," he said, his voice carrying across the silent gardens, "I believed I was protecting my family's honor." He looked directly into her eyes. "I was destroying it." He gently held out the ring. "You once vowed to stand beside me for better or worse." He lowered his head. "I gave you only the worst." Tears filled countless eyes throughout the crowd. "I cannot ask you to forget. I cannot ask you to pretend those days never happened. I ask only for the privilege of becoming the husband and father I should have been from the beginning." Elara looked at him for several long moments. The silence seemed endless. Their little boy suddenly leaned forward from her arms and reached toward Lucian with both tiny hands. The innocent gesture broke every remaining barrier. Elara knelt beside him. Without speaking, she placed her hand into his. Lucian gently slid the original wedding ring back onto her finger. The crowd erupted into joyful applause. Old Agnes, now leaning upon her cane, openly wept. Elara smiled through tears and walked toward her. "You kept believing when no one else did." Agnes kissed the little boy's forehead exactly as she had kissed his blanket months before. "I always knew his father would find his way home." The bells of Ashcombe began ringing across the valley. Then Lucian made one final announcement. He declared that half of the entire Ashcombe fortune would forever establish the Lady Elara Foundation, dedicated to building orphanages, village schools, hospitals, and homes for widows throughout England. Every future Ashcombe heir, beginning with their son, would be required to continue that mission, ensuring that compassion, not power, became the family's greatest inheritance. The announcement stunned the assembled nobles far more than any military victory ever had. They realized the Duchess they had mocked had transformed not only her husband's heart but the future of one of England's greatest houses. As the last light of summer settled across the palace rose gardens, Lucian and Elara walked hand in hand while their little son laughed between them, chasing drifting rose petals beneath the ringing bells. Behind them stood servants, farmers, soldiers, widows, and children united without barriers of birth or wealth, watching a family once shattered by lies become the very symbol of hope. Long after the sun disappeared beyond the golden fields, people would remember that glorious evening not as the day a duke reclaimed his duchess, but as the day kindness conquered pride, truth defeated deception, and one woman's unwavering compassion changed an entire kingdom forever.